To raise one clutch of chickadees requires about somewhere in the order of 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. Many of those caterpillars were destined to become moths or butterflies at some point. And without that essential food source, they simply can't raise their young. And so this is a different look at why pollinators are important, but and it expands to some other insects as well. But for many of us that love birds, we really need to recognize that maybe a little damage on our plants is going a long way to help support some of the birds that we really, really love. Another way that pollinators are really important for wildlife is in producing the berries and the fruits that you find out in the wild. This picture on the left shows one of our native shrubs that you see very frequently in parts of the foothills, but a lot along the Boise River greenbelt, and it's called a golden currant. They are blooming right now. They're one of the earliest blooming plants that we have in the native ecosystem here at Boise. And they produce these beautiful fruits in the summertime that go from orange to eventually a deep purple or black. And those fruits are eaten by many, many species of birds and require pollination in order to be produced. Another really interesting thing is that many of our pollinators are specialists on some of our native plants, and those native plants are dependent on those specialist bees in order to reproduce and produce seed. This picture on the right here shows one of our orange globe mallow, a native plant that you'll see in the foothills here in Boise. And those are some native globe mallow bees that really tend to specialize on globe mallow plants. And you can see how they're just crawling all over the center part of that plant and getting covered in pollen. And because these bees are specialists, and I'll touch more on this later, they're really going to stick to the globe mallow plants. And so they're very efficient at pollinating these plants because they're pretty specific to that species. So a lot of these foods that wildlife requires, whether it be birds or small mammals, wouldn't be around without the impact of pollinators. Okay, that's kind of just my introduction as to why we should care about pollinators and why they're important. And so I'll just pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions before I go on to kind of highlight some of the pollinators that we have here in Boise.
We don't have any questions quite yet, but I'm sure we'll have some more coming in shortly.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to start off talking about our pollinators with highlighting native bees. And I start with bees because in many ways they are the most important pollinators. And what makes them the most important is that they're the group of organisms or pollinators that are intentionally collecting pollen. Many of our other pollinators, like hummingbirds or butterflies, they kind of incidentally collect pollen as they are drinking nectar for the plants. It's not intentional. Whereas bees are intentionally collecting pollen. They're carrying it from plant to plant as they pack it on their bodies somewhere in order to feed their young and to provision their nest in some way. Globally, there's about 20,000 species of bees. In the US, that number is somewhere in the range of 4,000. And in Idaho, we know there's at least 700 species of native bees. We don't have a specific number. Unfortunately, they're very understudied. We don't know a lot about them. Many of them are very hard to study, and it takes a lot of work to get people out on the landscape collecting data about these. And that's where citizen science really comes into play. Many of these bees are specialists, as I mentioned, with that globe mallow bee. They're either specialists on a certain family of plants, like many might be aster specialists. And some bees in certain places are specialists down to a species. Plants like orchids tend to have really specialist bees that pollinate them. Something else about our native bees is that most of them nest in the ground, and you may be familiar with ground nesting, very unfriendly wasps known as yellow jackets. These bees are nothing like yellow jackets. They're solitary. So one little female bee will create a nest in the ground and provision that nest. They're not aggressive, but 70% of our bees here in Idaho are ground nesting bees. The other 30% nest in some sort of tunnel or cavity or pithy stem, and I'll show you some examples of what these nests look like in the next few slides. So these photos, starting at the upper left, that beautiful fuzzy bee is a Morrison's bumblebee. It's a species that is of somewhat concern in terms of its population is declining. And I love bumblebees. I think of them as the teddy bears of the bee world. They're fuzzy, they're friendly. They're just really fun to watch. The next one going across the upper left is another really fun bee to watch. It's a leafcutter bee. And if you have roses or lilacs and some other leafy plants as well, you might see these perfectly circular or semicircular cuts out of those. And those are done by leafcutter bees. And they actually cut a piece of leaf and then they curl it under their body and fly with that leaf to their nest, where they use it to line their nest where they're going to lay eggs. It's really phenomenal. They like to sort of have their rear ends up in the air when they're foraging, as you can see in that picture. And they actually collect the pollen on their bellies. So you can see all of that orange on that leafcutter bee's belly. Going down to the middle set of pictures, on the left, we have a bee that's very common on sunflowers and other aster family plants, and that is a longhorn bee, named because males have very, very long antennae. They're also very fun to watch, and you can see that individual is very covered in pollen. We have a metallic sweat bee in the middle right there, and another type of ground nesting bee on the bottom left called a furrow bee. And then one of our earlier emerging bees down there at the bottom right, which is a mason bee. And mason bees live in tunnels. You may be familiar with mason bee boxes. They're very efficient at pollinating a lot of fruit crops, as well as some alfalfa crops. So I mentioned bumblebees are one of my favorite. They are so fun to watch. They have some behaviors that many other bees don't. For one is that they can do something called buzz pollinate, which is essential for a lot of crop plants. For example, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, they all require nightshade family plants. Require buzz pollination, and basically the bees go up, land in the plant, and they vibrate at a certain frequency that causes the plant to drop the pollen that they can then collect. But bumblebees have a really interesting life cycle. So I mentioned earlier that most of our bees are solitary in terms of our native bees. But our bumblebees, of which there are about 24 species of bumblebees in Idaho, they're somewhat solitary. They're called eusocial. And so this picture here on the right shows their life cycle. This time of year in the spring, you're going to be seeing queen bumblebees that have spent the winter somewhere underground in a safe little protected space. They're the only bumblebees at this point that are actually alive, are the queens. So they come out early in the spring, as soon as it's warm and a few flower resources are out, and they start foraging and collecting pollen and nectar, and they find a place like shown in that picture here in early summer where they can start to build a nest. And their nest is most commonly in an old rodent hole, or it might be in just a little cavity that is protected somewhere under a log. Sometimes some species have nested in bird houses that have been put up, or bird boxes, but most commonly they're going to make a little nest somewhere underground in a rodent hole. And right now what these queens are doing is they're provisioning that nest, making these kind of little honey pots. It's not quite the same as you think of honey as honeybees, but they're making these little pots, filling it with food resources for the young, and then they will start to lay eggs. That first batch of eggs, they will all be daughters, and as soon as they all reach adulthood, they're going to go out and take over those foraging duties from the queen. So the queen will then stay underground in the nest and be cared for by all of her daughters throughout the summertime until late summer, early fall, when the queen will then start to lay male eggs, as well as eggs of a few new queens. And then those will go out and they will mate, and then the entire colony will die with the exception of the mated queen, who then will overwinter again. So they have this annual colony cycle that they go through that is very, very different from if you're familiar with honeybees. Mostly their colonies are relatively small, anywhere from 50 to a few hundred. Some of them can be up to 1,000 or a little more, but they're compared to a honeybee hive, they're much, much smaller. And only, the female bees are the only ones that are collecting pollen. You might see males drinking nectar, but the bumblebees carry their pollen in this kind of wet packaged blob on their hind legs, and then they'll bring that back to the nest. So keep your eye out for these queen bumblebees, and they're really essential to the survival of bumblebees in general, because those queens hold the key to the entire colony for the year. Those 70% of ground nesting bees, their nests look something like this. They're going to, just one little female bee will excavate this nest and have several little chambers where she will lay an egg. So first, again, she'll go out and forage for some pollen, make this little loaf of pollen, and then lay an egg on that. And for the most part, that's it. They don't do any care for their young. There are a few species of bees that actually do continuous foraging and will continually feed the young once they hatch. But for the most part, they lay an egg and then they might go start another nest somewhere. Often these nests will have multiple chambers and multiple eggs. But it's just one bee. And many of these bees are incapable of stinging. Also, you should know, if you don't, that all male bees are incapable of stinging. Only the females can sting, as their stinger is a modified ovipositor egg-laying device. But this is what you might see on the surface. Different species, these little kind of turrets might look different, but you'll see these little perfectly circular holes where the bees have made their nests. And then 30% of our native bees here in Idaho nest in some sort of stems, and particularly stems that are pithy, so they have really fine material inside, or that are hollow. And the way that you can help support these bees is following some certain guidelines when you do management in your yard. If you leave up these flower stalks throughout the winter, it's a really great food source for a lot of birds. For example, if you have purple coneflower, lots of goldfinch love to eat those seeds in the wintertime. And then this time of year, you can go ahead and cut those seed heads off. But if you leave somewhere on the order of 6 to 18 inches of that stem up, then these female bees will find that and they will build a little chamber inside. So you can see in this photo here on the left how, there's 5 eggs, each separated by depending on the species, it's going to be a little bit of mud or leaves if it's a leaf cutter. and then they'll just leave their eggs in there, they'll overwinter, and then emerge in the spring. Some of these stem nesting bees or cavity nesting bees will nest in holes that are drilled horizontally. So you might have seen those kind of bee boards that have holes drilled in them. Generally, the female eggs are laid towards the back and the males towards the front. So the males emerge first and kind of wait around for the females to emerge, and then they mate, and then the males are kind of done with their job for the year, and the females will then go on to provision a new nest. But here's an adorable little picture of a bee emerging from one of these stems. So the final category of bee that I wanted to talk about is probably the one that we hear the most about. And when people talk about saving the bees, oftentimes they point to the honeybees. But honeybees are not a native species to Idaho. They were introduced in the 1600s from Europe because of the honey they produce and the wax. And also the size of their hives allows them to be, placed in a location to help pollinate certain crops, particularly like monocultures where there's not a lot of habitat for the native bees. You can bring in these honeybees and they can help fulfill that role that native bees would otherwise. They're very different in their life cycle than our native bees, as that their hive is perennial. So it's going to keep surviving because of those honey stores that they build up throughout the winter. And they're extremely large compared to our native bees. I mentioned a bumblebee colony might have 1,000 individuals, maybe a few more, but these honeybee hives can have up to 80,000 individuals. And as you can see up there, that just one hive, the amount of pollen could support over 100,000 native bees. So honeybees are really important agriculturally. They're important in pollinating a lot of crops. Almonds in California are probably the one that comes to mind most frequently. And of course, our other bees don't produce honey, only these honeybees do. So they're extremely important for that. But when we're thinking about saving bees, I think one of the best analogies that I've heard of or comparisons is that talking about, honeybees are sort of like chickens of the bee world, or chickens would be to the bird world. So if you're saying, save the honeybees to save bees, you're kind of like saying save chickens to save birds. These are a managed species. They're basically like like a chicken or a pig or a cow. They're a managed animal. And they are extremely important and extremely cool. So I'm not trying to dissuade honeybees or say anything bad about them, but they're just very, very different than a lot of our native bees. They're super cool in their behaviors and their waggle dance. And, I'm a big fan of honey, so I wouldn't want to go without that. They're very, very different. Okay, that's just a little bit about some of our bees. So I'll pause here again and see if there's any questions that have come up.
We do have some questions.
Oh, great.
One, actually, I've asked, I've heard it's best for hungry pollinators to let dandelions bloom in the spring. I know folks may not want them on their lawn, but it's best to let them bloom in spring before the flowers bloom, because many of our perennials and our annuals bloom later than the dandelions. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. So dandelions are an introduced plant as well, but they do provide, if there are no other food resources available, they are going to provide that early season food for pollinators. So yes, if you can augment that with native plants that bloom early, that's even better. every plant has a different quality of pollen. So there's, they actually measure the amount of proteins and fats and carbohydrates in different pollens. And so different pollens have different nutrition, and dandelions aren't necessarily the highest quality, but when there's a lack of any other resources, yes, they can be a really important food source for a lot of species. And a lot of our really small bees I see on them early in the season. So yes, I think they can be a really important food source.
Great. Susan asks a similar question about helping the pollinators. Would one already cut the stems for the year or wait until maybe May to cut the stems so the pollinators can burrow? I think she's asking.
Yeah, so if you left your stems up throughout the winter time, which I think is what you're implying, then you can probably anytime, I mean, you can wait a little bit till it warms up, but because the bees aren't going to be super active when it's so cold. But anytime in the next, few weeks, you can cut those down, and so that the bees then have that habitat. And then the idea is you let the new growth come up and kind of hide that as it appears. And I'm already seeing this in my bee balm, which is a really great pollinator plant. The new vegetation is coming up, and in a few weeks it's going to be tall enough and you won't be able to even see those stems that I left behind. And then those old stems, hopefully you can just leave them forever and they'll decompose. But if you do have to remove them just because of, maybe you just have to in terms of the maintenance of your garden, if you have a little space just out of the way that you can actually leave them on your property, if you have to cut them earlier than you want to, or you just can't leave them up for whatever reason, you can just pile them up somewhere. That would at least give the bees a chance to emerge if they're still in there from the previous year.
Oh, great idea. And Susan responds she'll just leave them up, and she thanks you for that information. You mentioned bee balm. Are there some other plants that you would suggest for early pollen resources for the bees?
Yes, and I will talk about some of those a little bit later. In the presentation, I have some different plants that are really great ones. So if I'll hold that question, but if I don't answer it, please come back to it at the end.
Okay, we're interested in learning more. Thank you so much.
Good, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about monarch butterflies. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to see them in the wild. Unfortunately, we don't get too many here in Idaho, or at least over the past 10 years or so, we haven't seen too many. But the monarch butterfly is Idaho's state insect, which is kind of exciting. And also this year, for the second year in a row, Mayor McLean has signed something called the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which is an effort or an initiative by the National Wildlife Federation to engage communities in providing habitat and education opportunities focused on the monarch butterflies, because unfortunately their populations have really plummeted over the past few decades. So monarch butterflies are interesting for many different reasons, but one of them is their migration. It's really just one of those phenomena in nature, sort of like the, salmon, how they find their way back home, that just really blows your mind. So there's two different populations, although genetically they're one, but their kind of migration patterns are a little bit different that are identified. And one is east of the Rockies, which is a very large, compared to the Western populations, it's much larger and overwinters in the mountains of Mexico. And then the population that mostly comes to Idaho is called the Western population, and those butterflies primarily overwinter on the California coastal areas. So their migration is just really fascinating, as is their life cycle. So I'm going to start here in winter in California. And these butterflies that winter in California arrive sometime in October generally. And they primarily winter in these clusters in eucalyptus trees in California, many, many different sites. Then in very late winter and early spring, so usually sometime in February, as the seasons start to change, they start to leave those overwintering sites and go out to start to collect nectar and forage and to mate. And so they'll fly a small distance from their wintering site, mate, lay eggs, and then that generation of adults will die. Those eggs will then hatch and continue the journey north some distance, mate, lay eggs again, and die. And it's really the third generation that makes it to Idaho. Generally, they arrive here sometime in mid-June to late June, but those butterflies that come here, they've never been to Idaho before. They're a couple generations removed from butterflies that have been to Idaho. And as adults, all of those northward moving butterflies live about on the order of 5 to 6 weeks as adults. Then they'll stay somewhere north throughout the summertime, and as the seasons start to transition for fall, and as the plant that they require to lay eggs on, called milkweed, which I'll show you in the next slide, starts to senesce and die back and no longer be available, that last generation that's referred to as the Methuselah generation will fly all the way from their northward summer location to California in just one generation. So they don't stop to lay eggs. So it's 3 generations north and 1 generation south. And that southern migrating generation lives between 6 and 9 months. And they're able to do that because they shut down all of their reproductive processes to save energy. And it's just such a phenomenal thing that those butterflies that are flying back to California or on the East Coast flying to Mexico, they have never been to those places before. It's not like a bird migration where they're learning from, other birds that have done it for many years. None of these butterflies have made this trip before. So it's truly phenomenal to think that this tiny insect can have a mechanism that will direct it to do this. So monarch butterflies are also unique in that they have one host plant that they can use, and that is some species of a plant called milkweed. It's called milkweed because when you break the stem or the leaf, a milky latex substance will come out. And there's, I think, 6 different species of milkweed in Idaho. These one shown in the picture here on the left with the caterpillar on it, and also the flower down on the bottom is of showy milkweed, which is the most common one we see here in Boise. But there are several different species that you can grow here in Boise that monarchs will also lay eggs on. So the female monarch will lay an egg on milkweed, and once it hatches into a caterpillar, the caterpillar will eat and go through 5 stages called instars, where it sheds its skin and grows and gets fatter and fatter and fatter. And many species cannot eat milkweed because it contains toxins that are poisonous to most insects. But monarchs have developed the ability to metabolize that toxin, and they take it in and they actually can use it as a defense. So this caterpillar is munching on this milkweed plant and at the same time is building up this chemical defense in its body that makes it taste bad. They also have this really neat looking coloration that is an indicator to predators that it tastes bad and it shouldn't be eaten as well. So the milkweed flowers are incredibly beautiful. They have kind of this globe-shaped flower head with all of these different little tiny flowers on it, and it just smells delightful if you've ever been around it. And it's used by a lot of different pollinators. So I should clarify too that the caterpillar stage relies on milkweed. They can't survive. If you don't have milkweed, we won't have any monarchs. But the adult stage, they can nectar on any different plants. So it's important if you're trying to attract monarchs to your yard, that not only do you have some species of milkweed in your yard, but you also have nectaring plants that the adults can use besides just milkweed. This upper photo is a photo of the overwintering site where they're all clustering together. It looks like this might be early in the spring or late winter, early spring, when they're starting to move around a little bit. But I've never had the opportunity to go to one of these overwintering sites, but I've heard that it's just absolutely phenomenal just to see all these butterflies huddled together on these tree branches. And I wanted to show also a photo of the chrysalis. This is what they look like. They have this striking gold band around part of it and just this really vibrant green color. So unfortunately, monarch butterflies, especially in the Western population, have been really, really low compared to historical levels for the past few decades. You can see from this graph that in 1997, there was about 1.2 million butterflies. And the lowest point in recent years was in 2020, when they counted just about a little under 2,000 butterflies in the overwintering sites. So the way that they count is they have volunteers that go out to all of the known sites where these butterflies cluster in the winter. On 2 occasions, they go out in November, which is what this is representing, Thanksgiving count, and then again in January. And this is a community science effort. Volunteers are trained to go out and count these butterflies. So this blue line shows the number of sites that are monitored, which has actually gone up over time. And the green bars show the total monarchs reported. So thankfully, after that 2020 extremely low, very concerning level, 2021, we saw many more butterflies. There were about 250,000 in the Thanksgiving count. And then in 2022, this year, there were 350,000. And this count was done before all those storms that hit California in the late winter. And so the January count was lower. It's always lower, but it was a little bit lower than the average decrease. So it'll be interesting to see how many of these butterflies make it to Idaho this year. We had quite a few last year compared to previous years, but we're hopeful that this upward trend will continue. So before I go on, are there any questions about monarch butterflies that I can address?
We Debbie is commenting that she found that the migration so amazing. And we do have a question about if we're seeing more caterpillars in our parks, and as more folks plant milkweed, and where can we obtain milkweed plants for seeds?
Yeah, great question. Last year, so I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but Parks does facilitate a monarch and milkweed monitoring community science effort. And last year we did see more caterpillars than we had in previous years. I actually saw the first caterpillars I'd ever seen last year, which is really exciting to me. In terms of where you can buy milkweed, some of the nurseries locally carry it. But if you want seeds, we actually give out seeds at different events, and the seeds are collected here locally in our parks and in our pollinator gardens. So if you're interested in seed, I have just showy milkweed, which just is a really great plant, but it does spread through rhizomes. So just be aware that it's one that will find, it's a way and around your garden. It's maybe not like a well-behaved plant, but there are species that are well-behaved and only spread by seed. So depending on your space and what you need, I can help you find those resources if you just send me an email, but many local nurseries do carry it.
Okay, we'll put your email in the chat for folks to contact you.
Yes, please do. I'd be happy to get you some seeds.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight a few other pollinators before I get on to some of my favorite plants that are maybe unknown or underappreciated. This beetle to the left, I think, is just absolutely adorable. And you may not think of beetles as often being pollinators, but they crawl around on different plants. And so there's unintentional pollinators generally. They're not intentionally collecting it in most cases, although some do actually they'll eat pollen. But this little red beetle is milkweed longhorn borer. They actually chew on the milkweed plant, although I've never seen them damage the plant in any significant way. But they're adorable to watch. They have these really neat looking antennae, and they're just kind of a really fun thing to see on your plants. Another maybe underappreciated for sure group of pollinators are wasps. Wasps get a really bad name because there's a few of the social wasps that can be very aggressive, such as bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets. But the majority of wasps really have a life cycle like our majority of bees. They're solitary and they're out hunting other insects. So some are specialists on grasshoppers, some are specialists on spiders, some are specialists on, well, really almost any insect you can name probably has a wasp that comes after it. But many of the adults actually feed on flower nectar. And so they're going to be capturing prey to feed their young, but they themselves are going to be drinking nectar from different flowers. And wasps are incredibly diverse. And although many of them look like they have really intimidating stingers, those are usually just an ovipositor that they use to lay an egg, perhaps in an insect or through even wood into an insect. They're very, very fascinating, and they can be great pollinators as well. This guy I wanted to put in here because I've met lots of people that see these and think that there's something really horrible in their garden. But this on the upper right here is a ladybug larva. So if you love ladybird beetles or ladybugs, this is what they look like in their larval stage. And eventually it will pupate into a ladybug as you know it, but this is what they look like before that. So I wanted to point that out. They're incredible predators, small scale pollinators, but they're crawling around on plants and they are eating all of your aphids, both in their larva stage and as their adult stage. Other great pollinators are flies. This is a syrphid fly or a flower fly, and it is a bee mimic. So a lot of them look like bees. The really two main keys that are going to let you know it's a fly are these giant eyes, and also flies have tiny antennae compared to bees, but they can also be pollinators as they're going from plant to plant collecting nectar. This is our tiger swallowtail butterfly. And just another one of my favorite beetles to see on plants is this ornate checkered beetle. They can also be sort of red and black, or red and kind of a almost blue-black color. They are really interesting because what they're actually going to do is lay an egg on this flower that then is going to hatch out and hitch a ride with a bee into its nest. And then it's going to actually consume that bee larvae as well as the pollen and nectar that is in there. So they're really fun to watch, but they are not so good if you're a bee. So I mentioned, that monarch butterflies are declining. And unfortunately, many of our insects that do all of these wonderful things and all of this pollination for us are declining globally. And it's really not just one thing that's causing their decline. It's the combination of a lot of things, from the overuse of pesticides, whether those be herbicides or insecticides, fire and changes to their habitat, loss of habitat by urbanization, drought, changes in climate, so many different things. And some of these, can seem really overwhelming, at least to me they do. But there are things that we can do that are small in our own spaces, even if it's just a patio space with a few plants, that truly do make a difference, because many of these insects don't need a lot of space. If you just give them a few plants and a little place that's healthy, then they can get along. So here are a few of the things that you can do. As much as possible, if you can avoid pesticides, both herbicides and insecticides, but insecticides especially, because those are designed particularly to kill insects, which all of these pollinators are insects and fall into that. And a group of insecticides that's of particular concern are called neonicotinoids, which these are a group that are called systemic, which means that they are taken up by the entire plant. So it's not something that you just spray on the plant, might be there for a small period of time, but they can actually be incorporated into the plant seed. So when the plant grows, that entire plant, from the leaves to the pollen to the nectar, contain that insecticide. And so anything that is collecting the nectar, drinking the pollen, is going to be ingesting some portion of that. And many of these are very persistent. They can be in the plant for years. And once it's in the plant, there's no way to get it out. So when you're purchasing plants, make sure that they are not treated with neonicotinoids if you are concerned in supporting pollinators, because many of these sold in nurseries are actually treated so that they don't get eaten by things. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, but if you're interested in supporting pollinators, you can really, the more you can avoid pesticides, the better it's going to be for these critters. I mentioned leaving pithy stems. Here's an example of what it looks like when you cut those. We've kind of already touched on that. Another really important thing to consider, and I'll mention some plants that will help you fulfill this role, is year-round bloom. So as early as you can find some things to bloom is great, and having that continue all the way throughout the growing season as far as you can. Last year, we had plants blooming, all the way through November in some of our pollinator gardens, because bees are very seasonal. Some will come out early and they'll be done with their life cycle and have laid their eggs, and their young are just waiting out until the next season very early in the year, whereas others might not be emerging till late July, and they're really the fall bees. And so having these blooms year round is really important. You've probably heard the initiative to leave the leaves. Those bumblebees I was talking about, they're going to overwinter somewhere in a little hideout, maybe under leaves. Many other species of insects and pollinators are going to find a little tucked away spot, not to mention that leaf material, as it breaks down, is going to help provide some nutrition to your garden and your space. If you can't leave them, if you can, put a pile somewhere so that you keep them on your landscape. I know it's not always possible, but as much as you can, if you can leave some of the leaves. Leave some ground nesting habitat for these solitary bees. Like I mentioned, they're not aggressive. I've had those metallic green sweat bees in my yard for multiple years, and they're so adorable to watch. They'll come up partway out of their nest and just look around and dart back under if they see your shadow. And it's just really fun to see those. And they really do need that bare ground. So as we're paving over more and more space, they're losing out their habitat because, they can't dig in asphalt, unfortunately. And something else you can do is plant in clusters or groups. That helps limit how much energy these pollinators need going from plant to plant when they're foraging, especially those specialist bees that are going to be really focused on one plant or one group of plants. So if you can plant densely in clusters of the same species, that's really helpful. So going on to plant choice, let me just see how much time we have here. Oh, we're good. As much as you can, if you can include native plants. And that's important for a few different reasons. These native plants evolved in this ecosystem, so they have strategies to deal with pests. They are going to be adapted to the climate and the soils that we have here. They're going to provide the best nutrition in terms of pollen and nectar for our native pollinators. And they're incredibly beautiful. And when you use native plants, you really enhance this sense of space and what makes our ecosystem and our region different and unique by celebrating those plants that were here naturally. I talked about avoiding neonicotinoids. This sign up here said this plant is protected by from all of these things by neonicotinoids. That's not a plant if you're trying to support pollinators that you would want to put in your yard. You want to look for those labels that say, you know, pollinator friendly, not treated with neonicotinoids, because those are, you know, that way you're not going to be accidentally poisoning them by trying to do good by planting these plants. One other thing to think about is that now a lot of breeders are creating these really cool, showy, beautiful plants that have these double or triple blooms, these really complex looking flowers, which, you know, they're beautiful. And if your focus in your garden is just looking at beautiful from your eye or human eye perspective, they're great. But many times these plants have been bred so that pollinators can no longer access the nectar and pollen. So a lot of these complex flowers are really kind of a food desert for pollinators. They can't actually get to the pollen that's there. And some of them have even been bred so that they don't produce pollen and nectar, which if your focus is on pollinators, then you're going to want to avoid those. If you can have some diversity, diversity in bloom time, color, shape of flower. Different species are going to be attracted to different shapes. Bumblebees really like those tubular flowers, whereas some of the smaller bees like the flat acitur type flowers. So if you want diversity of pollinators, you want to have a diversity of color, shape, size, bloom time. And do a little research on your plants before you put them in. Avoid things that are invasive. So this picture on the bottom is some English ivy. English ivy likes to escape where it's been put and climb up trees. We're actively removing it on the greenbelt in several sites where it's climbing up some cottonwood trees, and eventually we'll choke them off and kill them. So avoid those things that escape. Another one I see around town a lot is donkey tail spurge or myrtle spurge. It's escaped into the foothills and has a very irritating latex in it that if you get it in your eye, can actually cause blindness. And it likes to escape, even though it's a beautiful plant, likes to escape where it's been put. And then just think about what plant would fit your location. So to have the healthiest, most vibrant plants, you need to put it in the environment where it's going to thrive, whether that be part shade, full sun. And that way you're really going to prevent some of these pest problems that might, you know, be pushing you to want to try some insecticides or something like that, because your plants are going to be naturally healthier. So here are some of my favorite native plants, and I'll tell you a little bit about when they bloom. There's many, many more. I couldn't put them all in here, so I just picked a handful, but we'll have a few slides of just some native plants. So earlier in the presentation, I showed you the golden currant with the berries. This is golden currant with the blooms. They smell delicious, kind of like a combination of vanilla and clove. Lots of different kinds of native bees use them, and they're just a really great native shrub that we have, early bloomer. And then just a little after the golden currant, the serviceberry will start to bloom. And it has these really neat white flowers, and then will also produce berries that like the golden currant, are also edible to a lot of birds and small mammals, but also both of these have berries that are edible by people and used in a variety of ways. So that's another fairly early bloomer, more in May. So the next few weeks, you'll start to see the serviceberry. And then if you're looking for a native fall shrub, rabbit brush is a really great option. It doesn't bloom until August and September. It has this beautiful golden, these beautiful golden flowers, and is used by over 100 different species of pollinators in the fall when they're just trying to collect that last little bit that's available on the landscape. Here's some of my favorite wildflowers. There's a great picture of this showy milkweed. You can see the whole plant and those beautiful globes of flowers. Again, that's one that's going to spread and fill in a space. So if you have kind of just an empty space you don't want to know what to do with, it's really, really great. Blanket flower you may be familiar with, but it's long blooming from midsummer all the way through fall. And lots and lots of different pollinators use it. I oftentimes see the green metallic bees on the blanket flower. For some of those pollinators that really like the tubes, you can think about penstemon. We have many, many native species of penstemons. The one shown here is the Rocky Mountain penstemon. It's about 3 feet tall or so, but just these beautiful purple tubular flowers. One of my favorite annuals is the Rocky Mountain bee plant. It gets to be about 3 feet tall generally, and it's also called spider plant, but it has just these really cool clusters of pink. There's also a species that's yellow, and all kinds of pollinators. You'll see tiny, tiny bees clustering on the very tips here of the flowers. And then you'll see, bumblebees, all different kinds, lots of diversity. For a smaller plant, sulfur buckwheat is great. It's these little kind of clusters of yellow flowers, and it will spread more like a ground cover and pretty low growing. And then, of course, there's the bee balm, which can get pretty tall. I've seen it grow up to maybe 4 feet or so. And a great story about bee balm. Last summer, we were in one of the pollinator gardens and we had this random rain shower, and the bee balm was coated with bumblebees. And as soon as it started to rain, they all crawled underneath the flower heads, like the flower was a little umbrella, and just hung upside down under the flowers till the rain stopped. And then they came back out. It was absolutely adorable. And a few other plants, these, besides the woolly sunflower, which is earlier season blooming, the other 3 here are late season. Lots of asters are more fall blooming. This is a false aster. It actually kind of becomes like a shrub, but then dies completely back in the winter time. And it didn't start blooming, I think, until October last year. Just this incredible high density of these white aster shaped flowers, and attracted a lot of really interesting pollinators. If you have a lot of space, this common sunflower, which is kind of our wild and crazy sunflower that we have here in Idaho, you'll see it along highways, is fantastic. Sometimes you'll see the flowers with, a dozen bees on there. And a lot of times in the evening, those male longhorn bees that I showed earlier will actually cluster on the flower head and sleep together at night. So if you get up in the morning when it's still chilly, you'll see these little clusters of bees hanging together on the sunflower. But these are just a few. Like I said, there's so many wonderful plants. I don't even have globe mallow in here, which I showed you earlier, but and I think I passed along some PDFs with some resources that have lists of native plants. So, all right, how much time do we have left? Okay. Any questions before I just wrap up by talking about community science?
You did, this is Sheena, you did mention the handouts. Everyone should have gotten an email or 2 with those handouts attached. So let us know if you didn't get those. Thanks, Kristen.
Sure. Any other questions before I move on to the last section?
We are good. There
All
are a
right.
few comments, but we're ready to
Okay.
hear.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to wrap up talking about community science, something that is near and dear to my heart. And it's essentially when any of us go out and help the scientific community by collecting some sort of information. And in some cases, it also involves analyzing that information. But most of the projects that I'm familiar with and that I'm going to talk about today are really just about collection. And this is so important because especially in the world of entomology and when we're talking about pollinators, there's just really not the research funding to send out biological technicians far and wide to survey all of these places. And so volunteers can take on that role while at the same time learning about the diversity and the places that they live and that they go out and collect data from. It's also a great way to meet like-minded people who are lifelong learners, which I'm sure all of you are, who love to be out in the community. It's a great way to get engaged with younger people or older people because it's intergenerational. Just so many wonderful aspects of community science. So one of the really great platforms that are available now for community science is called iNaturalist. And iNaturalist was started in 2008, I believe, as a master's project by 3 students at the University of Berkeley. And essentially what it is an online community that allows you to share nature observations of anything that was living. So it could be any plant, any animal, lichen, fungi, animal tracks, animal scrapings or markings, or even animal scat. So it's based on sharing a picture or a sound made by that creature, and then a community of naturalists, scientists, researchers, helps you identify that. So now this platform has moved from what was started by some graduate students to a joint initiative of National Geographic and the California Academy of Sciences. You can use iNaturalist online to just explore all different kinds of things without having to have an account. But if you do have an account, this is basically how it works. You set up a free account. The app is free as well. You record your observations by taking a picture or recording a sound. For example, last night I recorded some frogs singing, and then you share it through the iNaturalist app or the website online. And then other people who are using iNaturalist, they may be entomologists, they may be botanists, they will help you identify what it was that you found and discuss it, and it may actually get used in their scientific research at some point as part of a paper or some other work that they're doing. So here's just a quick little example of what it looks like. This is a snapshot from the online iNaturalist, so iNaturalist.org. And all I did is I went in and I wanted to see what species have been seen in Idaho, USA. And these are all of the species that users of iNaturalist have uploaded somewhere in Idaho. And they're organized by the most common to the least common. So I thought it was interesting that there's more red-tailed hawk observations than there are mallards, which globally, the mallard is the most commonly observed species. But one of the really cool things about iNaturalist, not only can you add observations that are useful, but you could also use this to search out if you're going to a new place and you want to see what you're going to see. You can just put in the place you're going and get a list like this of what plants and animals, and if you're a birder, you can see what birds you're likely to see anywhere globally, because it's used all across the globe, not just in the United States. So it's a really, really neat way to easily, just by taking a picture, contribute to science. So I want to talk a little bit about an iNaturalist event that's coming up called the City Nature Challenge. And the City Nature Challenge is a 4-day global event. There's 450 communities signed up this year. Between April 28th and May 1st, people go out and get as many observations of nature using iNaturalist as possible. And it's basically a little snapshot of biodiversity on Earth. So this video will tell you a little more about that. Also note that there are 2 photos in here taken by an individual who's a volunteer in a couple of our programs in Boise. So see if you can find those.
Look around you. Our cities are filled with wildlife we need to understand now more than ever. We can't fully protect nature on this planet without studying what's living in our cities. So here's how you can help by doing your part in joining the 2023 City Nature Challenge. Come together with over 400 cities worldwide and see how many wildlife observations we can gather. Every photo or audio recording you submit helps scientists better understand the biodiversity of our cities and further vital research around the globe. How does it work? It's simple. Using cameras and smartphones, tens of thousands of people all over the world take pictures or record sounds of wildlife in their hometowns during the same period, and thereby build an international database of urban nature that helps scientists and naturalists understand life in our cities and work to make them better places for humans and wildlife to live. Visit citynaturechallenge.org to see if your city is taking part between April 28th and May 1st. Then get outside and take pictures of wild plants and animals and upload them to our global database using the iNaturalist app or your city's preferred platform. Watch as experts all over the world help identify your observations. So put your nature eyes on and join the 2023 City Nature Challenge. Explore the nature in your neighborhood and help change the world, one observation at a time.
So I can tell you Boise and all of Ada County are participating in the City Nature Challenge, and Canyon County is also participating this year. And there are several other counties in Idaho that are part of it, Bonner County up north and many, many others. So this is our iNaturalist project page for the City Nature Challenge, featuring one of our great icons of nature in Boise, which is the peregrine falcon, who nest right downtown Boise and are the fastest animal on the planet. Pretty special to have them here in Boise. But to participate is just as easy as going outside anywhere in Ada County and making an observation in iNaturalist. Or we have a series of events, I think we're part of that PDF I sent out that you can participate in if you want to get together with others who are participating. It's a pretty fun event, and this is Boise's 4th year being part of the City Nature Challenge. So some other community-based science projects that we have here in Boise include Bee Watch, which Martha Brabeck, our foothills restoration specialist, and I started last year, which is an effort to gather baseline data about pollinators across several different landscapes in Boise, including some of our open space habitats and our pollinator gardens. And we're really just trying to see what kind of diversity we have and what flowers are most attractive to some of these different bees. So if this sounds like something that you might be interested in, it involves going out to one of these sites once every 2 weeks or once a week if it's possible. And we just kind of kicked it off, but we still have space for a few more people and can get you started. It's April through September. If you have vacation plans, that's totally fine. We can work with you, but it's a great way to meet some others who are interested in pollinators, as well as collect data here locally that we're going to use to drive our decisions about what plants we put on the landscape for restoration. Another community science program we have is focused on the monarch butterfly, as I mentioned earlier. This will get started in June. The first Saturday of June is the volunteer training, and I will be leading that. And essentially we have volunteers adopt a milkweed patch, and they monitor it throughout the season from June through September, looking for adult monarchs, looking for some of the other critters on the milkweed and the quality of the milkweed. as well as looking for monarch eggs. And all of this data gets sent to a larger database beyond just Boise Parks and Recreation, with an organization called the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation that does a lot of work and research on monarch butterflies. And that data, those data are also shared with lots of other organizations that are working on trying to bring back the monarchs. And then lastly, we have a really phenomenal group of volunteers who for several years, many of them, this is their 4th year, have been helping us monitor dragonflies in Boise parks. Dragonflies are this phenomenal group of organisms that spend most of their life in the water, but then we really start to recognize them when they're towards the end of their life and spending time in the aerial or environment or on land. They are really interesting. Several of them are migratory. So one of the things that we're trying to help out with our monitoring program is understanding migratory species and when they arrive and where they go. But we have volunteers adopt a pond and go out to that pond as often as they can, maybe once every couple weeks or once a week, and looking for these different species of dragonflies. We also have several events where the group will get together and we'll do a walk together and see what we can find. And it's just a really fun, phenomenal group. And the training for that is on May 17th. And again, you just contact me. I facilitate this project as well. And like I said, one other really great aspect of this program, and just dragonflies are so magical for so many ways. But last year we started a collaboration with the American Museum of Natural History, who has several researchers focused on dragonflies, and one PhD student who's working on his dissertation that is partially focused on dragonflies in Boise. And so we've been collecting some environmental DNA samples for them in order to, that's basically you collect a little bit of water and they can extract the DNA of dragonflies from that. And so comparing what we see in the aquatic system to what we are seeing on land has been really fun, and collaborating with these researchers has been amazing. So we're going to continue that this year as well. So this is my last slide, but here are a few other really great community science programs. There are literally hundreds of these programs that you can get involved. These aren't locally facilitated, but many of them you can do locally. So Bumblebee Watch just involves snapping a picture of a bumblebee and uploading it to this app. They're all tracking bumblebees. Sunflower Project is looking at pollinators on sunflowers, so you can do that in your backyard. The Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas is looking at bumblebees across many different landscapes in Oregon and Idaho and Washington. And it's a little more involved than some of the other ones, but if you want to really dive deep into bumblebees, that's a great way to do it. Lost Ladybug Project is looking at different ladybug species. And then the Journey North has all kinds of wonderful ways you can get involved with many, many different migratory species, including the monarch butterfly. So we finally reached the end of my presentation, and thank you so much for coming. But if you do have questions or want information about either pollinators or plants or how to get involved in any of these programs, please feel free to send me an email and reach out. I would be really happy to answer your question, or if I can't connect you with someone who can. So I'd be happy to take any other questions, and thanks again.
We do have a question from Trudy. She is asking if milkweed grows in North Idaho.
Great question. I'm going to try to stop sharing here. I don't know the answer to that for sure. I think so, but I would have to do some research. I know that some of the butterflies do make it to Canada, so I would guess that yes, it does, but I don't know what species of milkweed is the most common up north. So I apologize for that, kind of southern centric here.
And we did have a comment about the pesticides. I noted that I use hand removal with some kitchen tweezers
Sure.
and and natural dish soap and ladybugs, and that seems to help reduce aphids and other pests on my plants.
Yeah, and one thing I would encourage people to watch, and you have to be the judge of your own yard, but there are several species of wasps and flies that actually they're called parasitoids, and what they do is they lay an egg in an aphid. So I've seen this quite often on my lupin plants and also on my sagebrush plants. If I see an aphid outbreak and I just wait a little bit, I'll start to see these flies and wasps show up, and they actually lay an egg inside the aphid. It's a little dark and creepy, but what you'll start to see in a few days is what's called aphid mummies, and they just, instead of being the regular color they're kind of this brown color, and the fly or wasp larva, when it hatches out, has eaten that aphid, and they will take care of it. They're incredible predators, but you have to have kind of a healthy ecosystem going in your yard to support those predators. But it's really fun to see if it happens. And for me, it's like, oh yes, nature is taking over my aphid problem. It's so wonderful.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
We have some
One
wonderful
quick comment.
comments for you. Oh, yes. Go ahead.
So it occurs to me, Kristen, that maybe, so when you take in the pictures, especially I know with your cell phone, you actually are gathering data on exactly what that spot is, like longitude, latitude. And so when you upload it, that data goes to the scientists, which that's awesome. That's a good way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. You need to have your location enabled on your phone when you take the picture, so that your location is tied together. And so, yeah, then the scientists know on this date. They use it for all kinds of things, and it's really neat to see, at least for me, that my observations have been used. And in fact, when I first started using iNaturalist, I took a picture of a bee. I had no idea what it was, and it turned out to be something that was outside of its range, and it actually became part of a research paper, which for me was super exciting. I'm like, what? How is this interesting to anyone? But yeah, you never know what you're going to find. It's pretty neat.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I've tried to use it, and I figured it out. So if I can figure it out, anybody can figure it out.
That's why I love it, because I don't have a lot of patience for technology, especially when I'm outside, but it really is pretty easy. So.
We have some comments from folks. Fran says, this has been marvelous. Ms. Nojeski, you are an absolute treasure. Thank you. And Linda says, this has been fantastic. I'm in Council, Idaho, Adams County. I have many gardens at my home with many native bees and bee boxes. But we have an incredible community garden in Council, and she will pass this information on to fellow community gardeners.
Great.
Wonderful. Yay.
And Susan says, thanks so much. Kristen and Gypsy, and I'm sure Sheena is included in that. And Debbie says, outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. Lynn comments, very informative presentation. Thank you. And let's see, Debbie says, planting some flowers like marigolds, calendula, and mums can also help with insect control and add flowers for pollinators. I use them throughout my vegetable garden. And Gay comments, thank you for the great information. Now, if we can just see true spring arrive.
I'm so ready. I'm so ready for it. Yeah. Too many fake springs. Yeah. Wow.
Well, we
Thank you
really
so
appreciate your presence here today, Kristen, and we've learned so much. And we really appreciate all of our attendees today, and hope that you enjoy spring and you will be able to see some pollinators.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was truly an honor and a joy. And I would love to see pictures that anyone has of their pollinator gardens or what they see, or if you see a monarch butterfly, feel free to email them my way. So hope for spring. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Thank
Thanks.
you. And yes, there's a question. Can we get the recording? Yes, it will be available online. You just need to put in NKA and into your search engine, NKA New Knowledge Adventures, and you will be able to see recordings of all of our presentations that have been recorded. Thank you so much.